Michelle, when do you want to get started?
Let's give it another minute or so, and then I'll let you open it with, with instructions as to how to participate. Give it another minute or so. Do you see people signing in, or?
Let me check. There's still a few people signing in, so, okay. So you can give it a minute or two.
Yeah.
Send from my phone, see more. Come on.
Will, I know Marco was on a call, so we'll wait for him to have his audio turned on if he's ready for that. Yeah. I see that he is now.
Right now. Can I just speak to everybody through the phone?
Yes, you can.
All right.
Okay.
So if you can ask me to.
Okay, he's still on a phone call.
He's on that. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's give him another minute. He's talking, I think, to somebody about the meeting. So
I think so. Whenever he turns his camera back on, we'll get started.
Okay.
But if you want, I can go ahead and give the pre-meeting spiel for anybody. So we'll welcome everyone. If this is your first time joining Community Board 8 for one of our virtual committee meetings, we're happy to have you here. You'll notice that you're muted, and you're going to stay muted throughout the duration of the meeting. Only the co-chairs, Michelle and Marco, will be unmuted at all times, and any presenters that are making presentations during parts of the agenda. Following each presentation and each agenda item, the co-chairs will call on members of the public who wish to speak. You can do so by going to the reactions icon at the bottom of your screen and pressing the raise hand button there. You want to make sure you press the raise hand button. It says raise hand. It's not a wave or a thumbs up. If you press those, it'll go away. So look for the button that says raise hand. Only press it once. If you press it a second time, your hand will go back down and we'll miss you. If you're calling in from the phone, it's *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute. And be on the lookout for a prompt asking you to confirm unmuting once either the co-chairs calls on you. If you're having any problems with Zoom, the chat is available for technical support only. If it is not to ask questions of the co-chairs or of the participants, they will never see those chats. If you're using an older version of Zoom, you'll need to go to the participants section where you'll find the raise hand feature there. And finally, we encourage you not to raise your actual hand or wave at the screen. We might miss you and we would not call on you in that way. So if you're having any problems finding it, look for the chat and chat us. We're here for support. Go ahead, Michelle and Marco, whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much.
Will.
Welcome everyone to the vendor committee meeting of Community Board 8, October 12th, 2021, after a long hiatus. I'd also like to say to thank Will for helping us tonight, and also to introduce Zachary Glass, who I believe will be helping. He's a new CB8 hire, and he's the liaison to the vendor committee. We have 3 agenda items tonight. One is a review of past board resolutions on street vending. We won't spend a lot of time on it, but I thought it would be a good idea for you to see what we've passed in the past as a good predicate for reviewing the current new law, actually. My name is Michelle Birnbaum. I'm the co-chair with Marco Tamayo, who's on, and I guess we can get started with that. I'm going to ask the board office to put the vendor resolutions up on the screen one at a time. Let me just mention while they're getting ready to do that, that I'm very pleased to be joined tonight by Tangela Raman of the DCA, and she's going to help us with items 2 and 3. I'll give her a more formal introduction in a little while, but I wanted you to know that she's on with us and she will be talking to us later. So we can start, I guess we'll go in chronological order. So starting, well, actually from the earliest one. So here they are. So let's hit 2006 first, because that was actually one of the first resolutions that the community board passed. And it's actually the most comprehensive, so we'll take a quick look at it, because it was at a time when we were really considering all of the possible solutions to the issues that the community had been coming to us with on quality of life issues and street activity. So it's taking a little while to come up, I see, but how are we doing with that?
Give me 1 second and I'll get it working.
Sure. So that's one of the most comprehensive. And then you'll see as we go forward to 09, 11, 13, the resolutions become more specific, like they specifically address citing, assigning locations, electronic monitoring, notifying the precinct of how cases were adjudicated, restricted streets, you know, all those kinds of things that are very, very specific that we saw lacking in the existing legislation. Now, reminding you, this is 2006. This was way before Intro 1116 and 1116B were anywhere in sight. And it was a time when we were really pushing for a separate vendor enforcement squad, taking it not necessarily out of the hands of the precinct, but partnering with the precinct and the Department of Health in order to do some enforcing. So here it is. You can look through the whereases and you can see that in 2006 that they were pretty much, this resolution is really all inclusive. We'll skip the whereases and then look to the resolved. And the resolves are establishing the dedicated enforcement group, reinstating the vendor review panel, which actually we're told now it's really defunct as opposed to no longer existing, considering the reducing of the number of street permits, instituting 14-foot clearances on sidewalks. We now have 20 feet. Penalties being increased, rules of governing vendors to be standardized, vendor licenses to be issued, which would be difficult to counterfeit, signage and furniture used by street vendors to be standardized for easier compliance and enforcement. In other words, if each general merchandise vendor, for example, when he or she gets a license, they would get a standardized 8-foot table, a chair, a table covering, much like those that are used in art fairs or other kinds of fairs, and a pocket for their license to be displayed. The reason being that with standardized street furniture, it would be very obvious to a consumer that they were buying from a licensed vendor, and also very easy for law enforcement to enforce, because and also it would really lessen the visual blight. It would be far more attractive than the ad hoc general merchant tables that are springing up with all kinds of different covering. We ask that streets be restricted on ambulance routes, that they be restricted at transportation hubs, and that they be restricted from selling in front of a store that sells like merchandise. That item actually has been legislated in a 1946 law called the Good Humor Law, which actually ruled not to permit this kind of restriction. It has, certain groups, we have tried to present a legal case to overturn this. There's probably a legal case that can be made, but whether or not we can legislate and change, right over the legislation, we still can have some assurances, which we actually have in the new bill that we're going to discuss later, that protects store owners, bricks and mortars, from being confronted with direct competition right outside their front door. So you can have access to this particular item if you want to read further on it. I don't want to take the time now, but you get the gist. And if you have any questions later, we'll take them. Let's move on to, I think the next one is probably 2009. Okay, so 2009, you see that it's mainly talking about, again, repeating the establishment of a permit system tied to a vending location, but again, talking about a dedicated enforcement agency, and also that the city established guidelines on the design and appearance of push carts and sidewalk furniture, going to the point I expressed earlier about not only eliminating a visual blight, but also making it easier for compliance and consumer recognition. Next one, 2011. I think there may be two in 2011. Yeah, there are two. The first one is that we are affirming our resolution 06 and from 09, and that be it further resolved that we recommend that a separate vendor task force and a dedicated funding source under the command of the NYPD be specifically trained and dedicated to enforcing vendor regulation, and also for them to be conversant in vendor law. And the next one is, again, standardized street furniture and signage to be used by vendors selling general merchandise, again, to go to compliance and more visual attractiveness. So those were two in 2011. Let's go to 13. I believe there are three in 13, three short ones. Okay, so this one is that we urge stronger and more consistent enforcement of existing vendor law with respect to sanitation, garbage collection, and disposal. Next one. And 13. We also ask that the same food safety standards and inspection schedules that apply to others apply to food vendors, the same as applies to the bricks and mortar, their counterparts. We got a little bit of that now because we have some food trucks now have the lettering protocol that the bricks and mortar restaurants do. Is there a third one on 13?
That should be this one.
Yeah, the tracking system. One of the reasons we asked for this, an integrated tracking system to be created to assist all city agencies in enforcement and feedback for vendor compliance. Such a tracking system to be linked to the judicial system so as to provide feedback to the NYPD and other city agencies as to the adjudication of tickets. The reason we did this was actually in response to a direct request by the 19th precinct, who was increasingly frustrated with when they did some enforcement and vendors did appear in court based on their ticketing, that they never knew how the cases turned out. They never knew how things were ruled. And currently, and I believe still that's the case, that there's no real direct process for notifying the officer in charge or the precinct. Next would be 2016. We have 16, 17, and 18, and then we'll move on. So there, was that it?
Just taking a second to load.
Okay, this was actually, we were trying to address an internal rule in the Department of Transportation. Each of the city agencies not only has what they've been legislatively mandated to do, but they also have internal rules. And this was addressing this, that the DOT implement an enforcement protocol for this rule as soon as possible, which was the effects of vending in front of businesses. And we were changing some of the legislative protocols to be where the chapter rule in the rules of the city of New York, where you could read a G, whereas no peddler, vendor, etc., owned by or controlled by him or her to stop, remain upon, or otherwise encumber any sidewalk or street in front of any premises if the owner or lessee ground floor objects. So we were trying to bring in some commentary from the community and the bricks and mortar businesses. Also directing where a vehicle to stand on any sidewalk, any vehicle within 25 feet of a curb, or to stand anytime on the sidewalk or street within 500 feet of any public market, or 200 feet of any public or private school. We were asking for this because there was nothing that existed in the legislation. So we were hoping to put it into a rule. This actually went nowhere, unfortunately. 17 and 18.
Did you get 16?
Was that 16?
That was last one was 17. This one's 16.
Oh, okay. That was 17. So this is this is currently that. Oh, yes. There used to be a vendor review panel, and in the past, a community, a vendor, any resident, any organization could take their either grievance or request to this panel, and this panel would somehow mediate what that request was. And we had a way to make, through that, we had a way to make an application for streets to be restricted with respect to street vending. And that could be heard and acted upon in a timely manner. Currently, no such protocol exists. This was in 2016. My understanding is that it still does not exist. I didn't see it anywhere in the current legislation. So we did 17, this is 16. Will, is that right?
Yeah, you're just looking at 16.
Okay, now we need 18, and I think that concludes. Let me just say, while this is being brought up, at the time of past 18 months during COVID, the mayor had lifted all enforcement of vendor activity. So over the past year and a half, there has been no enforcement of vendor law. You may have noticed that yourself if you walk down streets and you saw more than one 8-foot table, if you saw merchandise on either side of a pedestrian way, whatever you noticed. So because we had been having difficulty with vendors fighting for certain locations, literally fighting, We ask that an entity be formed to address and assign locations for food and general merchandise street vendors, and that such an entity have significant input from the community board and residents and the businesses in the community. We thought that was very, very important. And there are many, many ways to do assigned locations. You can do it through a bidding process. You can do it by altering cost. In other words, if you had a cart or a table in a less trafficked area, you would spend less on your license than you would if you had a cart or a table in a more high trafficked area. We did not speak to the method, but we did think that some methods should be put in place for fairness and also to eliminate confrontation. Since this time, we had advocated for electric chips to be put on, monitoring chips to be put on each of the carts as they came in for their licenses. That didn't exist. However, it does now. And we thought this would be a good idea for two reasons. Number one, monitoring location. But number two, and probably even more important, you could track a vendor, a food vendor, as to whether or not he reported every 24-hour period to a commissary. Every food vendor has a commissary to which he must report every 24 hours to guarantee cleanliness of his cart, to get merchandise, to get potable water, et cetera, et cetera. These commissaries are privately owned, and so each vendor has to find his own commissary. A problem that we were having is because they were privately owned, if they were not profitable, an owner could close it, and then a vendor would have to just hustle around and try to find another. So we thought that a tracking mechanism would be not only beneficial to track infractions, but also to make sure that the sanitation and cleanliness activities are in keeping. Now, that has been put into place, but my understanding is I see it nowhere in use. I don't think they've come up, the powers that be, which are new powers that be now, which you're going to hear about, have come up with a method to use this chip system. However, they did think it was important enough to have it installed with each new request for license. So I guess we can hear more about that. So I wanted you all to see that because we haven't met in a really long time. I wanted you to see it so that as you evaluate or you hear about the new passed vendor law, law number 18, which was the outgrowth of intro 1116B, you can now look at that or hear about that and ask your questions about partially relevant to what the community and we were looking for over these past many years. I'm sure you'll have many questions of your own, but I wanted you to have this basis. So I'm not going to take questions on this at this moment because they'll all become relevant, as we go to the next agenda items. So agenda item 2 is a review of the new vendor law passed by the City Council. And here's where I want to introduce Tangela Rama, who is the Director of Consumer Affairs at the New York City Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, which is now the new name for the Department of Consumer Affairs. So Tangela, I know that you are going to comment even more extensively about Consumer Affairs' new role as the enforcing mechanism. And I have comments about reviewing the law as it is states now, but we'll be happy to jump in and add to it. But if you want to comment on what this law currently embraces, sort of a very quick overview, and I'll join you in that so we have some basis for the discussion of agenda item number 3, which is the role that DCA will now play in enforcement. So yes. You are there, Tangela?
Yes. Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes. Can we all hear?
Yes, we can.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Well, I wanted to just thank you very much for joining us. I'm very pleased that you're here. I thank you to Charlie Driver at Community Affairs for working with you to be here tonight. And I am also want to tell you and everybody else that I'm going to be very, very mindful of your time. So with that, I'll turn it over to you. And you can feel free to meld agenda items 2 and 3 as you see fit. And if Marco and I or anyone else has any comments, I guess we'll raise hands or jump in. So I'll hand it over to you. Thank you, Tangela.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Will, for having me here today. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tangela Rahman. I work in our External Affairs Division at the New York City Department of Consumer and Worker Protection. I oversee our Community Affairs team. So I just wanted to quickly go over, this local law 18 and this, Office of Street Vendor Enforcement. So pursuant to local law 18 of 2021, the mayor earlier this year designated the Office of Street Vending Enforcement at our agency, DCWP. So we are now the home of this office, which, was created by local law 18 that took effect in March. As the home to the Office of Street Vending Enforcement, DCWP, we enforce unlicensed vending activity and time, place, and manner vending restrictions citywide. Within weeks of this local law 18 lapsing into law, our agency published and disseminated outreach materials in designated languages to promote vendor compliance. We worked closely with the business improvement districts, advocates citywide to survey and educate vendors. And we also conducted 2 virtual webinars with the Street Vendor Project over the summer for mobile food and general vending. And so we began broad-based enforcement on June 1st. Before that, we did a lot of outreach and education citywide. And I just wanted to mention that, street vending enforcement, it will always require a measure of interagency cooperation. So, for example, NYPD, they'll be called on to enforce unlawful vending on MTA property, including in subway stations, and will be implicated in enforcement that violates the penal code. For example, like a vendor selling counterfeit or stolen property, NYPD will be able to enforce that. Other agencies like health will be called on to enforce food safety. Parks Department will handle vending in the more than 1,700 parks citywide. And sanitation or DOT may also be called on related to matters under their jurisdiction. So currently the New York City law caps the number of general vendors at 853. Per New York State law, the cap does not apply to honorably discharged veterans residing in New York or their surviving spouse or domestic partners. In all, there are over 2,000 legally licensed general vendors. There are 11,345 people on the non-veteran general vendor waitlist, and the waitlist is currently closed. If the prospective applicants on the waiting list falls below 300 individuals, the department will reopen the list. Regarding mobile food vendors, there is currently no cap on licenses for mobile food vendors, but to vend, you need a permit. There is a cap on permits, although the recent local law did raise that cap for mobile food vendors by 4,450 over the next 10 years. And we do have information on our website for the Department of Health regarding applying for a license or permit. DCWP, we're doing our best to enforce the laws as currently written. We don't have the latitude to change the law. Only the city council can do that. That said, we've engaged in a lot of outreach campaigns and, we are conducting broad-based enforcement. By and large, the NYPD is not involved in day-to-day enforcement of vending in New York City. That said, the NYPD does continue to enforce criminality like counterfeit or vending on MTA property. And in extraordinary cases, the NYPD will assist DCWP in enforcement for like recidivist unlawful vending activity. We also work closely with the business recovery unit that's led by former Chief Monahan. to address issues facing the business community, and we work with our external stakeholders, community partners, sister agencies regarding like vending inspection. I wanted to mention that, you know, though the Office of Street Vending Enforcement, you know, our agency has been enforcing unlicensed activity and time, place, and manner vending restrictions citywide, as I mentioned, since June 1st. Currently, our enforcement has 14 inspectors in the field dedicated to vending, so that's 7 teams total. And, you know, as I mentioned, the street vending enforcement is always going to require a measure of interagency cooperation. And our, you know, we work closely with our sister agencies regarding any type of complaints received, you know, for inspections. I'll hold off for now, Michelle, unless if there's any questions or if you wanted to add in.
Yeah.
I just wanted to give a quick overview briefly to everyone.
No, that was good, Tangela. Thank you very much. Because we'll get into the weeds as to how you're going to do this enforcement. In other words, will inspectors actually go out into the street from one agency? If you encounter counterfeit goods, or that would be criminal activity, I think that's still under the jurisdiction of the police, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
But for daily enforcement, for example, like the Department of Health has agents that actually walk into the street, and if they go to areas, and if they see violations, they give tickets. Now, the Department of Consumer Affairs used to be a licensing agency, and so you were responsible for the legality of the licenses, but you never actually sent agents into the street to monitor the streets and to give tickets where there were infractions. So that will be new for you. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. So this is all very new to us. You know, and as I mentioned, other agencies, right, they're empowered to issue violations as it relates to their respective jurisdictions on vending, right?
Yes.
And our agency, you know, with regards to enforcement, you know, we prioritize like compliance from street vendors when we arrive at a location, either if we receive the inspection request through our external affairs division, right, or through the business recovery, you know, initiative that's led by Chief Moynihan, or through 311. We work, you know, our enforcement team, we work to submit an inspection request. And so, you know, when we arrive at a location, you know, our inspectors will inspect the nearby vendors in the specific location for their appropriate license and compliance with street vendor regulations. And so should the vendor refuse to correct like the violation, they will be issued a summons. As I mentioned, at times, our agency will conduct joint inspections with the NYPD to facilitate compliance.
Yes. Now, we have over the years, Marco and I and others, we've walked the streets at that time with the precinct, and we've pointed out infractions, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the citizen being the reporter, or the citizen being the monitor. With this new law, you're now going to be adding, and I have questions specifically about it, as others do, I'm sure, but you're adding 4,000 new what's called supervisory licenses over the next decade, starting in 22. So it's 400 a year. 10 permits allow Manhattan vending or any other borough if they choose. The rest allow for vending in other boroughs. The question is this: you have 15 inspectors now, is my understanding, and that's for the 5 boroughs. Is that correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, number one, are you planning on growing this group? And number two, what's their daily protocol? They report for work in the morning and they do what?
Yeah, so, you know, currently we have 14 new street vendor inspectors in the field operating in 7 teams. We have 4 new inspectors onboarded who are in training. DCWB continues to staff up and support our vending team with the goal of to have 20 inspectors operating in the field. And as I mentioned, our inspectors, depending on the complaints that we receive, right, through either, different channels, our inspectors are out in the field conducting vending inspections. And as I mentioned, certain inspections, NYPD may assist them.
So you are out in the field doing this, and are there inspectors assigned by borough?
I will have to follow up on that. These inspectors work, as I mentioned, they're operating in 17 citywide. And so they go to specific locations that we receive, vending, whether they're like vending hotspots or locations that we receive through our external stakeholders for complaints.
Does, my last question, then we'll go to the public.
Yeah.
Does your department, what will they consider an adequate and effective staff? I mean, you're now hoping to end up with, say, 15 after your training. Is that going to be what your goal is, or are you planning to increase it?
No, we're looking to expand, but as I mentioned, our agency, we have limited resources, right, for this Office of Street Vending Enforcement. And so, we're doing the most we can right now, right? The law was passed and we're doing our best to implement it during, historical fiscal strains on the city and this pandemic. There are challenges. During the aging process, when the local law was passed, the council was made aware of the administration's concerns, regarding current resources and circumstances, but we hope to expand, right, our work under the Office of Street Vending Enforcement. And as I mentioned, we hope to have, our goal is to have 20 inspectors and operating in the field, and hope to get, additional resources to do our work.
Was there an additional funding source to this?
I would have to follow up with you regarding the funding.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We have members of the public here that have some comments or questions. Also, you can ask questions about what the new local law is as well. I was going to give an overview, but I don't want to, I want to bring some of you in, so I don't want to just narrate. So if you have questions, you can ask and we'll fill in later. So I think the first.
Michelle, can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, Marco.
Okay. This is for the public. We have the Department of Consumer Affairs, Tangela. This organization only covers the general vendors. Food vendors do not cover. So probably if somebody else has question about the food vendor, she won't be able to answer the questions. This is for Tangela, the question. Do you think, do you still have the same regulations of the tables for the general vendor 8x4, and this table should be 20 feet away from any main entrance or a specific entrance that you decided, or you has been changed these regulations?
I'm sorry, was the question is you cannot vend within, what was it, 5 feet, and then within 20 feet of the sidewalk cafe? Was that the question?
No, the question is for the entrance of the buildings.
This bill. It's 20 feet in this.
Oh, entrance. Okay, entrance of the building. So under our, we have our inspection checklist available online. So under the code, you cannot vend within 10 feet of any street corners, subway entrances and exits, or driveways. You cannot vend within 5 feet of bus shelters, newsstands, public phones, or disabled access ramps. And you cannot vend within 20 feet of sidewalk cafes or stoop line stands. And then we also have information on you can't vend, within a bus stop, next to like a no standing zone or on a median unless the median is a pedestrian mall or plaza. And then there's also information on our website regarding display requirements. So you have to, your display is no more than 8 feet long, 3 feet deep, and 5 feet tall. And you cannot, use, you can't place items for sale directly on the sidewalk or on a blanket, and you must leave at least a 12-foot wide clear path on the sidewalk for pedestrians. And your cart and stands and the goods you are selling must be at least 20 feet from the entrance or exit of any building.
Yeah, so that really hasn't changed. Those laws really haven't changed very much
It has not.
In this new local law. The secret here is enforcement of all of this. I walked by a street vendor, a fruit vendor the other day who had fruit on his, not an 8-foot table, but 2 8-foot tables, and also on the other side of the pedestrian way, so that when the pedestrian walked by, they had fruit on either side of them. So the whole secret here is in the enforcement, as it has always been. As I look through the law, things haven't changed very much. And will you post, either put the link in the chat or post it on, or both, post it on the board's website, local law 18, so that everybody can take a look at it at their leisure?
Yeah, my colleague Charlie can send the links to the checklist as well as the text of local law 18. We can definitely follow up.
Okay, that's great. So now I see first up, I think, is Barbara Krieger. Will, can you unmute?
Yeah, Barbara, be on the lookout for a prompt. There you go.
Yes, I'd like to know why street vendors are allowed to use plastic bags and my local grocery store is not.
Plastic bags. Okay, we'll have to follow up with that on the plastic ban.
Okay, so maybe if we get the answer to that, we can send it to the board office and we can circulate that. Okay.
Yeah, so the bag waste reduction law is actually the state passed this law. And so we can, the State Department of Environmental Conservation began enforcement of the plastic bag ban that on October 19th of 2020. And so in New York City, businesses are required to, collect a non-taxable 5-cent fee from customers on paper carryout bags. So we don't enforce this law, but, we can look into it as well.
Okay, Aura. Next would be Aura Masarski.
Hi, Ms. Rahman, your information is very interesting, but to be very polite, I don't see where the intersection with reality is, because every violation that could possibly be a violation is something that I see every day in my neighborhood. And I'm wondering if you could clarify what is considered a permit. Because let me give you an example of a Mr. Husnugul who owns, as far as I can tell, 4 vehicles with his name on it. He has 4 stands that I know of. And because I know about the vendor project, which is doing a great PR job as portraying vendors as these poor immigrants who are just trying so hard to make a living and blocking the entrance to tax-paying stores. But this gentleman owns a house in New Jersey, and I have the information because it's on Google, that is worth slightly over $750,000. He just got a new vehicle, and you can see one of the vehicles in this driveway on Google Earth. My question is, what do you consider a vendor? Mr. Gould owns 2 big trucks, which he uses as warehouses on the street. In addition to, he's never there to shop. He's just goes around and supervises. So my question is, what is a permit?
Yeah.
Is there any inspection is there any inspection that the person who is vending actually is the person on the permit, since there's no permit being displayed?
Yeah, so regarding general vendors, so certain folks do not need a license to sell items that are covered by the First Amendment, right? Including written materials like newspapers.
I'm aware.
painting.
We're talking about fruits and vegetables.
Okay, so Department of Health issues, the licenses and permits for mobile food vendors. And as I mentioned, we do inspect for unlicensed activity, as well as time, place, and manner. And the Department of Health, they issue 6 types of food vending permits. 5 of them, I think, are required to renew every 2 years. So when our inspectors go out there, first we ask if they have a license, whether it's the general vendor license or mobile food vendor license. And we also have our inspectors carry an inspection checklist. So along with checking to see if they have a valid license, right, not an expired license, they have to check if it's active. And they also must check for the rules under our New York City code for mobile food vendors, like if they are vending in a restricted area, right? What kind of items they're selling. And our inspectors look for that. We sometimes, as I mentioned, work with NYPD. We cannot confiscate items or discard them. And so there may be some locations where we do joint operations with the NYPD, but our inspection checklist kind of goes over what our inspectors look for related to our rules and regulations for GCWP. As I mentioned, there may be certain complaints that would have to be flagged for our sister agency, right? Other sister agencies, for example, like sanitary issue, like undercooked food, et cetera, that's Department of Health. If there's any type of, smoke issues, that's Department of Health, DEP. Illegal dumping, right? Like grease or food waste, that's DEP. If it's unattended property, so if the vendors are leaving tables or chairs, right, chained to sidewalk furniture or left behind after hours, then the sanitation department or Department of Transportation can go out and inspect along with NYPD. If it's like trash, right, then it would go to Department of Sanitation. Any type of illegal, like mobile food truck idling in the street, we encourage our stakeholders to contact the local precinct, to look at the street condition issue or any type of illegal permanent structure that would go to, Department of Transportation. As I mentioned, street vending enforcement, it does require interagency collaboration. And so, as I mentioned, like, for example, the NYPD, they can enforce and use their discretion in the field as necessary. However, the administration did remove PD from day-to-day enforcement of street vending effective earlier this year. And, we do work closely with our sister agencies to, conduct inspections.
Let me just interject here, Aura, because you'll be interested to know this is an ongoing issue. I've been working on vendor concerns for almost 30 years. There has not been an improvement on what you are addressing. You are right that a lot of this are big conglomerates. They're not necessarily one individual person working for himself. The vendor that is on the street is working very, very hard, has long hours with no breaks, no hygienic facilities, and very often is exploited by the people that you are talking about. So that community, the vendor community, is and can be an exploited community. What this new law addresses is something we have asked for over all these many, many, many years, and that is one person, one permit, one truck, so that they can't employ others to be there. Now, there are some exemptions to that. And that would be, for example, a handicap vendor who doesn't have the physical capability of manning the actual truck or cart. And so that person would act in a supervisory capacity and have a person who would be more physically capable of handling the job. That's a different situation. There's also another category of veteran vendors, and we have one on our call. I'm happy to see that Barbara's here. And unfortunately, veteran vendors, when all these rules and regulations and expansions and we're now adding 4,000 vendors and we're adding this and we're adding that, they are always left out in the cold. When they are adding 1,000, you can get the veterans, they've got 35, so to my mind, they're never treated fairly. And I think if they were treated fairly and people did want to buy from vendors, they would be, and they were properly signed, that people would be very or most happy to buy from a veteran vendor. And if there are any others on the call, I thank them for their service as always. So there are different categories of vendors, but you are quite right to notice what you've noticed. Again, this has been something we're after. If this is not addressed, it is addressed in the current legislation. If it is not enforced, it will be meaningless, just as everything else we're talking about. And enforcement has to do with the numbers of enforcers. We asked for this enforcement squad from this board as early as 2016. I personally, many years before that. It won't matter if the ratio of enforcers isn't significant to the ratio of vendors. So when I hear that we have 15 and we may be going to 20 and you've got 5 boroughs, I mean, granted, Staten Island maybe isn't as busy, but Fordham Road in the Bronx sure has its problems. Sunnyside sure has its problems. The Korean Grocers Association in Queens has been up in arms about the lack of enforcement. Our various neighborhoods here, our committee had an intern do a complete mapping of every vendor in our neighborhood, every kind of vendor. Marco and I personally drove up and down the avenues, marking the corners and noting how many kinds and who and how many. However, when their produce is in the tree pit, when the cart is expanded from 1 to 2 carts, when a general merchandise vendor hangs up clothing racks as though it were Bloomingdale's, when they in fact set out their purses in front of Bloomingdale's, and when a store like Bloomingdale's doesn't have the clout to eliminate it. This new law, to my mind, we're here, it's an educational meeting tonight so that everybody knows about this. My expectation is low unless I see a real increase in the number of the enforcement squad that clock in every day and then go out to the street, and then their job is monitoring infractions. That's what I'm interested in. If they are not doing that, then you will not see any real change in the enforcement resulting from this local law 18. So having said that, just because I want you to understand, Aura, that we understand, Marco and I have been working on this in our outlook that we did. We actually wrote down the names of every distributor that was written on the side of every inventory truck that stands in the street 24/7 with no monitoring of the temperature of that produce, either in the winter or in the summer. And we called every one of those distributors, identified ourselves, and got hung up on, because this is a big deal. We acknowledge that. The law that as it was passed, I testified Others testified, I think Margot did too, on 1116B, trying to make changes to make it a more more reasonable law in terms of enforcement, and also not to badger the legal vendor and not to badger the compliant vendor, and not to make those vendors comply with laws that we don't have yet. I would like to see additional laws, but if we don't have them, I don't expect them to be punished for it. But in terms of what does exist on the books, we've worked very hard. I do not have a lot of confidence until I hear more that this new law is going to do any better, but we can hope. So I hope that gives you a little reassurance that we understand it. We've been working on it. We will continue to work on it, and we will continue to push, because even this agency that has this law, this is not to say that we maybe can't institute some rules. Every agency has the possibility of internal rules. It's too early because they're not up on their feet yet, really. And we're just beginning to digest this. Too early to jump to that, but have no question that we're going to be looking into that in the future.
As an informant, Michelle, I think one very important part that everybody should know is we're going also to request the judge to not dismiss the fines. It has to be enforced, the fines. Otherwise, the DEP can do the job and the judge will dismiss the tickets. And the tickets has been probably issued because there is a violation. And I think that's also Michelle work in that direction too. Thank you. Go ahead, Michelle.
Sure. Okay, Robin, member of the public.
I've been also, I started with Michelle years ago, and we had a truck leaning out into 2nd Avenue and into a bus lane. And the only reason that vendor moved was because I think there was an accident probably on 2nd Avenue where he was blocking the vision of a parking garage where people would pull out onto 2nd Avenue. But aside from that, there was no regulation whatsoever. And now that same vendor is on a corner, catty corner to where I am, and he never leaves for a commissary. They never get clean, whatever, they clean it themselves, but they are in that spot. And no one, and I'm with Michelle, I don't see how 15 people can possibly keep an eye on all of these vendors. You know, they're just so strident. They know what they could get away with. These people don't listen to anybody. I mean, I've gone and I've said things to them in the past, and they don't care. They say, I don't understand English. But, you know.
Hey, Robin?
Yes?
Oh, I had a question. So this is, I guess, a vendor, right? That's like on transit property. Has the local precinct been contacted? And if not, if you share with us the location, we can, follow up offline regarding this vending. And if you guys share like the cross streets with us. But regarding any type of MTA property, if there's any type of transit vending happening, like LIR, MTA property, including like in front of
no. It's an independent cart, and it's been there for years. Okay. And when it found its spot, and it would leave for the commissary once. The idea of a chip sounds like a great idea. This way you could check off who actually comes back to the commissary and who doesn't. It's a way of keeping track with not as many inspectors as you would like to have, but somebody's accountable. As soon as they find what they can get away with, they follow that road, and they have nobody stopping them because they know nobody is there to watch. And you have an eye on all these on all these restaurants that have to keep clean and standards, and they get shut down if a pipe breaks. And these vendors just don't even, some of them don't do anything to comply. Right. And it's been for years. In my neighborhood too, there's a little tiny store that opened up, of a coffee shop that I can't imagine what his rent is. And he sells mostly coffee and snacks. And each morning, right across about 10 feet away from him is a coffee cart. And I feel so bad for the guy who's paying rent because, that coffee cart he comes and goes and nobody stops him. And it's like the Wild West. And I don't see that anything has changed. And I don't know how it can change if you have 15 people inspecting a huge city like this. It doesn't make any sense.
Let me just jump in. It can change. You saw some of our suggestions as early as 2016. Had any or all of those been implemented, you would be looking at a different landscape. Let me also say this. There is no legal spot for a truck vendor in the city of New York. Now, is that their fault? Not necessarily, because we've been asking for assigned spots with tremendous input from the community. I don't want some, people outside of the community just arbitrarily saying, well, that corner will be a vendor spot and that corner will be. No, we have to sit down with a plan, and we can do that. And we know where the competition is, and we know where the struggles are, and we know where the density is. The community knows. This is not lost on us. We had truck vendors lining up on Lexington Avenue north of 86th Street at the meters. Now, it is not legal to vend from a meter. It's not legal for a general merchandise to vend his inventory out of the back of his van. That's not legal. However, it was long and hard. Dan Gorodnik helped us to get some of those vendors moved away. However, you couldn't enforce them being there because you couldn't prove that they were there for more than the hour unless you marked their tires. You couldn't verify, and there was no mechanism for doing that. So a lot of the enforcement, there's no mechanism for it. But we have methods. We know how to do this. The problem is nobody has asked us. This law calls for an advisory board. It has a monitor board. I'll give you the structure of it later if we have time. I don't want to take time from people talking. But the bottom line with that advisory board, when you read it closely, this advisory board has the power to review and evaluate the effectiveness or restrictiveness and equity of sidewalk space and whether or not this new law should be amended to accommodate their results. In other words, if they think we need more vendors on the street, it'll be within their jurisdiction to make that decision, as well as other things. So with the whole construct here, I'm not sure that the community has as much input as it would actually like. But I don't want to get into the weeds because I don't want to bore everybody to death. But the truth is the weeds are very important. So we hear you. Let me just say that we have a very compliant vendor with us, an old friend of mine, Barbara Morris. Can you unmute Barbara? And I'm really glad you're here tonight. And Barbara, maybe you know where Dan is. Dan is another vendor who vends in front of the museum, he's a veteran vendor. We always welcome him, but I don't see him today. But anyway, welcome, Barbara. How are you doing with all of this?
Thank you. We're not doing too well. Dan apologizes for not being able to attend the meeting. He couldn't figure out how to do the Zoom. But anyway, he it's been a very difficult time for us as disabled veterans. I have a few comments and I have a few questions. I don't want to take much time, but I'm hearing things that don't really set with me. I requested a meeting with the commissioner or the new person of enforcement, the enforcement unit, and I was denied. And I was given a checklist that's filled with inaccuracies. And I requested another meeting with the agency. I was referred to the street vendor project. And I just want to make it very clear that the street vendor project legally does not represent the agency nor the disabled veterans. Unless they're a member, they don't represent me. I don't know why I was referred to that organization. I was very upset about it, especially because at the hearings, they profess to be involved with the black market leasing permits. And
They're lobbying.
also, and let me
They're
just
mainly a
finish, please,
lobbying
please let,
agency.
no,
I'm gonna
no, let
you
me just finish.
completely. I'm just explaining they're a lobbying agency.
Well, the problem I had was that when they're lobbying, they're not telling their constituents or their members that those permits that they could get were readily available. They could get green cards, they could get seasonal permits, but instead they're saying they want citywide permits, but they could be out working. The churro lady could be working. All right, having said that, I just want to move on from that because they do not represent me or most of the disabled veteran food vendors that I know of, or the general vendors. The one question I had was again, if anyone is there from the health or the consumer affairs, I beg that we get a meeting with the enforcement unit to discuss the inaccuracies in the checklist. They're going to have major implications to disabled veterans. But I also have a question. What actions are, and I want to pose a question, what actions are being taken when a vendor operating a permitted cart is not the person who is listed either on the owner's list or is not the permit owner? What actions are you taking?
Hi, Barbara. This is Tangela from DCWP. We'd be happy to follow up regarding if there's any type of information that is incorrect. If you feel in the inspection checklist, we can definitely follow up.
We need a
meeting.
We need a face-to-face meeting with the head of the enforcement, because there's too many inaccuracies and they're too detailed to get into in a meeting like this. Michelle would understand it, but most people won't. That again, we're getting into the weeds. But we really are begging the agency. We're begging the agency for a meeting, not with the street vendor project, with the agency.
Can you facilitate that, Tangela?
We could, Barbara, do you have my email address?
No, I don't know who you are.
Okay.
Maybe Michelle, if you want to connect me to Barbara offline, and
yes,
we can
Tangela Barbara is the director of Community Affairs with the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, as the DCA is now called.
Yeah.
So I will get you Tangela's email. Is that all right with you, Tangela?
Yeah, that's fine. Mm-hmm.
And I'll get Tangela Barbara's email. And I'm hoping that you will be able to arrange a meeting. And Marco and I would like such a meeting as well.
I think we can combine that probably.
We can combine that. I see no harm. But we can discuss that if you like. But Tangela, if you're willing to facilitate that, that would be really terrific and helpful to Barbara.
Yeah. We really appreciate it. I mean, we're out there struggling, and there are so many different sets of rules for us. We've got parks rules, we've got GBL 35A rules, we've got health department rules, we've got DCA rules. We don't know what the hell rules apply to us anymore. And as a vendor, a food vendor, I can't find a good location because they're all run by a specific unit of people that will muscle us out. And they don't have any connection to the permit owner. And that's a big problem. And I think that this bill, this new law, is only expanding that. And I think that there really needs to be a serious discussion with the agency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I definitely understand the concerns. Some challenges we face in the field include, street vendors who may refuse to comply with regulations, right, or furnish identification, or refuse to correct their violations, right? These are some of the challenges. As I mentioned, we've never conducted street vendor enforcement in the past, so there is a learning curve, right, associated in standing up like a complex enforcement operation. And, to address some of these issues, as I mentioned, we have worked with our agency partners, such as the NYPD, right, to facilitate compliance. And as, Michelle had mentioned, the local law 18, the street vendor advisory board is a step, right? in kind of working on like recommendations and framework that can lead to more compliance. So we definitely understand some of the challenges, and Michelle, feel free to connect me to Barbara offline, and we can follow up as well.
Which I will. Tangela, let me just say this. I went to a 19th precinct meeting at the beginning of the month, addressed the vendor issue with them. You cannot call the precinct anymore for enforcement. This is out of their hands. They said it's out of their hands. It is out of their hands. I know you're
I was told the same thing.
Yes, I know you're working with them when it comes to counterfeit or criminal activity. But if a vendor is not compliant for other reasons, or they don't answer those calls anymore, they don't even have the ticket book. They didn't have the ticket book when they were enforcing, and they don't have it now. And I'm talking about non-compliance such as this. You take the hospital zone, take New York Hospital, take York Avenue and 70th Street, just as a random thing. On the southeast side of York Avenue and 70th, the popcorn truck is there all the time, even though there's no standing ever. Now, that's a hospital zone. That area has to be cleared for many reasons. On the northwest side of 70th Street and York Avenue, the ice cream, or not Carvel, but the ice cream truck is in the unloading zone for the paratransit vehicles. I've spoken to him to please move. No. Now, you have to understand that, as I said, there is no legal spot for a truck vendor to be. They're not supposed to be on the side streets. They're not supposed to be at a meter. They're not supposed to be at no standing. This calls for some kind of citing, but I hesitate to throw it out there because I want to be very sure. I don't want your agency to do citing. I want the community boards to work with the agency to do citing. But citing, and now that you have chips and a tracking system, is certainly the way to go to make everybody compliant. You have to understand that for vendors of all kinds, veteran, general, food, whatever, this is a business. If you are in business, when you pick out a location, you go to the most crowded location. That's where you go. You don't make decisions that are the antithesis of what will benefit you and your business. We understand that. But there is a way for all of the stakeholders to live together here. But we can't seem to get enough clout, meaning the community, can't seem to get enough clout with the agencies. I've spoken personally to the mayor about this. I've spoken personally to the city council about this. We all have. And it seems to go on. And I have my reservations as to whether or not this new law is going to make a difference, unless the enforcement squad grows very substantially. Zachary's okay, so we can go to the board now, unless anybody else from the public has any questions. Otherwise, I'll go to Rami. He's a member of the board. Hi, Rami.
I'm Michelle, thank you. So I'll keep it brief, but I have a few points. Of course, in our community, can everyone hear me? Because I'm having like insane technical difficulties. Yes.
Speak up, because your voice is trailing off, but we can hear you.
In our community, especially by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we have a lot of veteran vendors, or at least vendors with veteran licenses, or are in veteran labeled carts. And those are, as previous speakers stated, those are really important to our community and to New York as a whole, supporting our nation's heroes. So I just want to make sure that those vendors are being supported, and if even if they possibly unknowingly commit an illegal act or have violations, making sure we're supporting the vendors who served our country. So does this new local law address veterans at all, address veteran licenses, address the current veterans program that is in effect?
Some of veteran law, Rami, is governed by the state. So there are laws of the
But I'm
state.
asking about this
But in
current.
terms of this law, Tangia, I did not see veterans mentioned in a very specific way as I read it, but Tangia is far more conversant with this law.
So regarding the local law, we're enforcing it as it's currently written. I mentioned we don't have the latitude to change the law. Only city council can do that. So if there are any type of recommendations from external stakeholders, we recommend reaching out to the city council. And I can follow up offline if there's anything specifically related, to veteran vendors as the law is written right currently. But as I mentioned, we are a city, agency, government agency, and we cannot change some of these vending laws as they're, as they currently are. And so
Right.
that would be up to the city council. And as Michelle mentioned, there are certain laws that are from the New York State, right, that have been passed. So there's, different jurisdictions.
Right. Thank you for that. Recently, about 3.5, 4 weeks ago, there was a video circulating of a food vendor in the South Bronx, I believe, who's Fordham Road, yeah, whose cart was torn apart, disposed of by Department of Sanitation. By one article I read, it was an estimated of $10,000 worth of produce and equipment that was disposed of by a joint NYPD DSNY group task force. I don't know what they're doing. But the reason why that video is so concerning, and the vendor turned out to not have a license to vend, and there are all sorts of issues and legality around her cart. But the issue was that as a food vendor, she was one of the sole vendors in the community, including supermarkets that provided fresh fruits and vegetables at an affordable price for the residents of the area. Many parts of our city, unfortunately, are labeled as food deserts, which are, as I just described, areas where fresh foods are not readily available, or readily available for a cheap price, or the foods that are not readily available for the residents in that area. And so our street vendors are actually one of the lifelines to a healthy city and a healthy environment. What can you comment at all on any of that enforcement, making sure that
Rami, let me just say you're conflating two things. The entity that addresses what you call the food desert is called
no. That's not my question, Michelle. My question is how is the I forget the agency, your agency's
CCWP. Yeah, so I can see that the agencies involved, right, with what happened in the Bronx, they're working, we're working together to ensure that there will not be wastefulness like that in the future. And, going forward, any food that needs to be confiscated, all the agencies that were involved are working to avoid that. And going forward, any confiscation, can be distributed to a food recovery nonprofit, right, where it can be distributed to the community. Right. So, the agencies are working to ensure that, any type of wastefulness does not happen like that in the future.
Let me just add to that, if I may, Rami. I don't want to conflate two different things here. One, the confiscation. There was nobody who watched that who was comfortable with that. That was a call, I think, by those sanitation people on the ground at that moment. I don't think that's protocol for any agency. However, they did not necessarily have the right to give it away because they couldn't clear it as being helpful or whatever. Maybe that wasn't the wisest decision. I think we can all agree to that. Addressing the vendor, however, she had not had a license for 1.5 years. What they did to the produce is a separate issue, was not correct in my mind. But we have to address the fact that she had not had a license for a year and a half. Her claim was that she couldn't get one. But the fact is that under the green cart license, which is a different entity of uniformed carts that specifically provide fresh fruit and produce in areas where maybe supermarkets are lacking, there were those licenses available. I nor anybody else can speak to why she didn't apply for that. But this was a very high profile circumstance because there was a visual of throwing away food, which is never a good visual, and it was wrong. But it didn't address the issue of her legality and whether or not she needed to be legal and her own personal circumstances, which are her personal circumstances. So I just want to make that distinction clear. And this bill does address green carts. It does talk about green carts. I should also add the Green Card program was a very unsuccessful program. And our brave council member, Dan Garodnick, was the only one of two people in the city council who said it was going to be a problem because it confined the kind of merchandise that you could have, and defining the merchandise and sending somebody into an untrafficked, unpopulated food desert did not guarantee an income source for a green card owner, and therefore nobody wanted to be a green card owner. But I think we could reconcile that with some kind of, mutual discussion. Finish up, Rami, and I'll go back to Barbara.
One more point, and Michelle, you're going to love what I'm about to say, is air quality. I frequent the vendors near my school. You'll catch me every morning at cart right outside my school, and sometimes for lunch, I frequent the halal cart next to my school. But we have a big problem with generators. I go to school in Union Square, so a little bit outside of our district. But in any case, it's a big issue with quality of life for both us as consumers and people that live in the neighborhood. Having generators blasting out in front of our buildings all the time, and B, for our climate, of course, polluting the environment and making sure that for our vehicles, we have emission standards. For our generators, we do not. And I just want to know if DCWP is addressing air quality or addressing faulty power sources or illegal power sources, or what's going on with that.
At a council hearing, the DOT testified that the emission of one vendor cooking on the street, as though you had a barbecue out there, was the equivalent of a truck traveling 3,000 miles cross country to California. So your concern about emissions is very valid. And it was a matter of fact, the DOT was asked to take over enforcement of street vending, and they turned it down. As an agency, they didn't want a part of it. These emissions, not only from the propane tanks and whatever the cooking source is within the trucks, but also the street vendors. Like, you couldn't go out and barbecue. If you wanted to take your barbecue out in front of your house now, barbecue a steak, that's against the law. And yet you've got people, in essence, barbecuing all over the city. And yes, there is visible particulate sent into the air. And at the moment, there is no enforcement. There's no standard for it, I should say. But you can comment further, Tangela. I just wanted Rami to know that, because I want him and everybody else to understand that there's a tremendous history here of talking about vendors of all kinds. And so many of these issues have been raised. And to this date, all these years later, there's not been much progress, and this law does not help it. But go ahead, Tangela, if you have any additional comments, or Marco.
Yeah, so I was going to say regarding air quality, right, vehicle idling, odor complaint, the New York City Department of Environmental Protection does have, enforcement under their code, like air pollution control code. Our agency, as I mentioned, we have been conducting vending inspections as it relates to unlicensed activity and time, place, and manner violations within our inspection checklist. And so, you know, certain sister agencies, they can, you know, inspect for things that may be under their jurisdiction. So, you know, we can only inspect, you know, vending under our rules and regulations. And so certain complaints, as I mentioned, you know, we can refer to our sister agencies for follow-up.
But Rami, to your point though, there's nothing about that in the current rule. You can see it yourself.
Yeah.
My question was really is DCWP doing anything regarding emissions? And thank you for that answer. And it seems to me, as Michelle, you pointed out earlier, that we've constructed a web of interagency madness that contributes to either horrible enforcement, no enforcement at all, or enforcement of non-issues. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you for your comments.
Let me comment something,
Thank you.
Michelle. Let me comment something, Michelle, about the food vendors. The food vendors in the Bronx. I think for those people that feel bad, I think there is a contribution of $13,000 for these street vendors.
Yes,
So,
there was.
So I think it was very bad action what they did. They're supposed to recycle the food in another direction, but they have to enforce the law. If we don't enforce the law, because whatever status you claim, it is wrong, because the law, it has to be complied with everybody else. Not because in this case is a fresh food. No, actually, I have my opinion different. It's a fresh food. Sometimes if you approach to these food vendors, you see that in this hot temperature, how are you gonna preserve the tomatoes? How are you gonna preserve the strawberries? Most of the strawberries sometimes I'm seeing is completely wrong. They should rotten completely. It should be removed. There is no enforcement in that part. So to say fresh food, I think is very relative, because the supermarkets, whatever it is, they maintain a good temperature of the products, especially the perishables. And affordable, sometimes, yes, it's true, affordable. Depends what you consider affordable. Probably in our community board, probably it could be affordable. But if you put the prices in just on the 116, the prices are not affordable. So this business is completely unregulated. It has a serious disparities. And yes, I support to have street vendors on the street, but it has to follow the regulation that you mentioned very well, Michelle. We need to know exactly where they are, how we can enforce these rules. About the air quality, yes, the air quality, the only way is you have to measure the exhaust for these generators. And the problem is the only agency authorized to do that is DEP. But DEP, they're not going to go to street vendor by street vendor. It will be very hard to enforce. Now they will lead probably to have a different kind of energy. Maybe solar energy should be. I think one street vendor on the Central Park, and by the way, he is a veteran, and he has a solar power. So then we can have a clean air, and they can still operate in their business. So this is my comments. Thank you.
Barbara?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I think a lot of the points were already hit. I heard a comment saying that there was a learning curve, and because it's a new agency doing the enforcement. The problem is that we, again, without a meeting, we are in the field. We're not represented in the law on their advisory board or anywhere. And we really need to link with the agency so that we can give you our expertise, being out there and seeing what we see and we just need clarification. We don't need a new law. We need a clarification. I can't urge you enough to meet with us. The second thing I wanted to comment on is someone mentioned the Met. There are several carts there that are run by one group. They're not disabled veterans. They have no connection to the permit holder. And this has been an ongoing problem all throughout the city. And again, I posed the question, what are you going to do about this? I don't seem to get any answers. Maybe when we meet, we can get some answers on that because it is a problem. I also have been in touch with the precinct and they told me the same thing that Michelle told you. They wipe their hands clean of this. They don't want anything to do with it. Right. So when there's an issue, they tell you to call 311. You call 311 and no one ever comes. Vending issues are just, it's so chaotic. And while your agency is trying to flush it out and figure out what to do, we're getting tickets that we have to defend. And most of those tickets are such nonsense. And we're legitimate. We are the owners. We are the permit owners. We're the ones working in the carts. We're not a group of people who are renting permits and using, other means. And it's very frustrating to us. So I think that you could use our help and we're willing to work with you. But again, we're not being represented by the Street Vendor Project. And that's pretty much all I have to say.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I know I promised Tangela I'll be respectful of her time, and I know her aim was to maybe be done by 8 o'clock. Can I just ask a couple of questions and then I'll remain the meeting will continue because we can do some further clarification of the law. But nowhere did I see in the law, Tangela, any mention of fees for licenses, fines for infractions. Does the 400 eventual expansion of the community include both food and general merchandise vendors? Are truck and fruit stands included in the food category? Are green carts separate and not counted within the 4,000? It wasn't really clear to me. I'll repeat them again, but can you address some of that?
Yeah, so under the local law that was enacted this year, Department of Health is going to issue an additional 445 mobile food vending permits each year for 10 years beginning in July 2022. So, people who are already on a mobile food vending waiting list and have held a mobile food vending license since March, I believe 2017, will be eligible first. Is regarding to the types of permits available, we can definitely follow up. As I said, we work with Department of Health as they are the ones that will be issuing these, mobile food vending permits, right, beginning next year. And so, Michelle, we can follow up regarding, what that entails. Yeah.
Oh, so that's new. That's new then. We work with Mr. Middleton over there. He usually comes to our meetings, but I didn't ask him for this one because we were talking about the law. But so you mean that that they are going to be issuing the licenses, not just doing enforcement?
Department of Health.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. So basically, we encourage vendors to visit the Department of Health website for more information about applying for a license or a permit. As I mentioned, there's currently no cap on licenses for mobile food vendors, but to vend, you need a permit. There is a cap on permits, although there's a recent local law, it did raise that cap by 4,450 over the next 10 years, but that is under the New York City Department of Health. And so we can connect you to our, counterpart. But I believe you guys, Michelle, you may have, right, someone that you're speaking to in the health department.
Yeah. Oh, so that's a change.
Yeah.
So we can talk to them. But how many new licenses are going to be permitted per year?
It's going to be an additional 445 mobile food vending permits each year for 10 years beginning. beginning next July 2022.
So when you say mobile, you're referring to the truck vendors?
Correct, mobile food vendors, yes.
And what are you calling the carts, the cooking carts?
Oh, you're not talking about the green carts, right? You're just
No.
the cooking carts.
No, where cooking is being done, you know, barbecue or whatever.
Right.
How are you categorizing those?
Right, we'd have to follow up with the health department on that, you know, on what the new law, what it covers.
Oh, so that's a big deal. We ought to have Mr. Middleton in then. And what about fees for licenses and fines for infractions? I didn't see those defined.
Mobile. Are you talking about fee to obtain a mobile food vending permit license?
Well, I saw one fee was $25 and a supervisory fee was $500 for a year or 2 year period.
I mean, I think the Department of Health, so we process the applications, but they're issued by Department of Health. So, you know, their website may list all of that information depending on the type of fee, you know, permit. If it's like a mobile food vending seasonal permit or, you know, other type of mobile food vending permit, they have information on their website regarding, you know, the fees associated.
So you don't know what about fines for infractions? They're not cited in this law.
Fines for, is it for mobile food vending?
Infractions, yes. If somebody is parked 5 feet where it should have been 20 feet and he gets a ticket, what's the fine?
So the fines, it ranges, you know, depending on the type of violation that we, you know, we observe. So I believe for food vendors, the penalties, right, associated with violations that the Office of Street Vending Enforcement will issue, the penalties range from $150 to $1,000, and you know, plus $100 a day for continued unlicensed activity. Non-unlicensed violations range from $25 to $500. And I believe there's nothing curable in Title 17 or the Department of Health rules. For general vendors, the penalties range, you know, similar, 50 to 1,000 plus $250 a day for continued unlicensed activity. And non-unlicensed violations range from 50 to 500. And so, you know, those are kind of the ranges for, you know, for financial penalties associated with the violations for our rules and regulations.
So before I go to Barbara and let you go, can you, and see if Marco has anything to add, but can you explain the difference between a permit, a license, and a supervisory license? I thought I had, but I perhaps wasn't as clear as I should have been.
I think so. That would be a question for Department of Health, Michelle. Yeah, since they're the ones that issue the mobile food vendor license. Okay,
because those are talked about in this law. Marco, you have anything else that you want to talk?
Thank you so much, Tangela, for coming today, and I would appreciate your knowledge. And we're looking forward to meet with Barbara. Thank you.
Yes,
thank you so much.
I really appreciate it, Tangela. That you were knowledgeable, and hopefully will get back to us with a few of the things that you needed to check on, and then I'll follow up with getting you and Barbara in communication, and hopefully Marco and I can get to meet with enforcement at the agency as well. So I'll thank you again and let you go, and then if anybody else has any questions or if they need more information about the law, I didn't go through the law point by point by point, but I do have it here point by point by point, but I didn't know if you could stay awake. Aura, maybe you're awake.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Have a good evening, all right?
Good night. Thank you, Tangela.
Hi, yeah, still awake. So as I'm listening to the recitation of all the different agencies and departments that are supposed to be involved in enforcing this law, I think I stopped somewhere south of the Department of Education. I know I'm being facetious, but we have all these agencies that are supposed to enforce something. And we have interagencies. Now that's when you get into heavy duty bureaucracy. And as Marco points out, there are rules and the rules need to be enforced. And they're only going to be enforced if someone actually does the enforcing. And if we have Department of Health, Department of Sanitation, Department of the Police, Department of Transportation, and so forth and so on, there's no end to it and nothing gets done. So I'm wondering, is the city council accessible or available to listen to these concerns? Because they passed a law, okay, heavily influenced by the vendor project, fine, understand. But this is like sabotaging it before it even begins.
Let me say this, Ola. This is the very thing that we testified when testifying in opposition to the entirety of 1116 when it was an intro before it became this law. And the whole point was to put vendor enforcement under one umbrella. And that was the point. That was what they were trying to do. And then they came up with this. So some of us saw it in the initial, Marco saw it, I did. Now, in addition to the enforcing agencies being many, it used to be that the DCA was a licensing agency. The NYPD was an enforcing agency. The Department of Health was an enforcing agency for the food involved carts and trucks. The Department of Sanitation and environment, you know, for the propane tanks and all that. And they each paid attention to their individual jurisdictions. The whole point was to put that under one umbrella of enforcement. That did not happen in this rule, which was in this law, which was passed by the city council, who you are asking as to whether or not they are sensitive to testimony. I sent every member of the city council a copy of all of our resolutions and asked them to please try to put some of that in there. With the exception of the flood, none of it is in there. The Street Vendor Advisory Board, which is going to govern this whole mess, is the Commissioner of Consumer and Worker Protection, of Health and Mental Hygiene, of Small Business Services, of Transportation, and the Police Commissioner or the designee of any such commissioner. 6 members appointed by the Speaker of the Council, 2 of whom represent street vendors, 1 represents the small business community, 1 represents organizations representing workers at retail food stores, 1 represents property owners, 1 represents community organizations, and 4 members appointed by the mayor. 2 represent street vendors and 2 represent small businesses. So if you look at that, that's the advisory board. Now that advisory board is an overseer, which is an enormous overseer. And as I mentioned before, this board can make recommendations as to whether or not the number of licenses should be expanded, restricted, or otherwise altered based on their analysis of how the program is going. I can see that this is fraught with potential pitfalls. So here it is. We will continue to make our pitch by trying to meet with all of these people. We've met with their likenesses in the past. Now they're working as one function group and try to address our concerns again. But I'm sorry to say, I strongly doubt that it'll be addressed in legislation, because this is the new brilliant, fabulous law, the big outcome of all these years of major discussions. None of it represents what we've asked for. So that's why I spoke about internal rules. Each agency has internal rules, and maybe we can get some, because that you don't need to pass the law for that. If you can get an agency to make a rule for itself and the members of that agency support the rule, you might be able to get something done through that. Marco, anything else?
I think you covered pretty much everything, unless somebody else want to ask some questions.
Any other questions, something that was missing from this that you'd like to know? You can read the whole rule in its entirety. I think it's about 19 pages. I have it here. It's 20 pages, double spaced, so it's readable if you want to go ahead and read it. Rule number 18. Anybody else have any comments or questions? Or I think at our next meeting, when we schedule that, we're certainly going to have the Board of Health in and to talk about enforcement. Barbara, you have another comment?
Yeah, Michelle, one of the things that I think that maybe you and Dan and I and Marco could sit down and talk about the law, because we've read it over and over again. And I think we can maybe help clarify some of the questions that you had about it, and in the health department's involvement as well in giving out the permits and the supervisory licenses, et cetera. And we'll be more than happy to sit down with you.
That's great.
Well, I'm pretty upset about the whole thing too. It's not going to be easy on us that are legally vending. It's really going to be very difficult.
Has your cart been equipped with a chip?
Yeah, but it's not working.
No,
they're not
for it.
My cart has one. Yeah, well, our carts have them on. During inspection, they put it on, but from what I understand, they're not working.
No, they have not implemented a program for the chip. The only
not that I'm aware of.
No, I know. I spoke to them. The only program they implemented was putting the chip on the cart. They have no program. They haven't written a program for the chip. They don't know what they want the chip to do. They don't know what the aim of it was, but they did recognize that in the year 2021, when everything is electronic, that it would be a good idea to have the capability of monitoring whatever in the future you choose to monitor, but at least the chips will be there. So maybe we can be influential in talking with them about what we think would be a good idea to monitor. And you and Dan and others would be valuable in that conversation too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the law really is going to create more chaos, and it really is expanding the black market more than anything, because it doesn't address it. And it's going to be even more difficult. And I think someone talked about the vet. And as I said, there is a bunch of carts there. They have disabled vet on them, but they're not run by disabled vet. They have no connection to the vet, the operators of those carts. And it's throughout the whole city. And, you're going to give these poor people permits and supervisor. Now you're going to have rent-a supervisors. That's another problem. I do think that we have a lot of commonality here. And and I know that the disabled vets are up in arms. Some guys I haven't heard from in a long time are furious about this. They're very confused and they're easily manipulated. And we don't want to see that happening either. So, And
of the unlicensed being removed from the streets now anyway. I mean, at the very least, before they get into enforcement of law, the first thing is to get people who do not have a license at all. Let's start with getting them off the street, unnecessary competition for the legal vendors, veteran and otherwise. And I haven't seen any swift move organization of any kind for that. So
no, there's basically been no enforcement other than the ones against us at the Parks Department. They'll come around and give us tickets every now and then for something stupid. But there's basically no enforcement. I mean, I live on the west side, and the fruit stands are block long. and it's a mess.
Yeah,
It's just
supposed to be
chaos.
tight, but they're not.
I just, from listening to the speaker tonight, again, we can't afford to go through a learning curve. You know, this is our livelihood.
Yeah.
While they're learning, we're getting tickets. And while they're learning, the illegally leased carts are running the show.
What are you getting tickets for?
Stupid stuff, really stupid. A lady it's nonsense. A lady came by and saw that Dan put some ice from our bucket near one of the trees. She called the Parks Department on me and said I was killing a 100-year-old tree with ice cubes. Parks came and they didn't know what to do, so they gave me 2 tickets for something ridiculous.
Okay, well,
you know, that kind of stuff. And we've got to fight them.
Yeah.
You know, the fines are they're the same. They haven't changed, but I
thought they weren't addressed.
No, they're not addressed. But it's just that constant harassment of us that are legal. And if I went into the subway and sold churros, you know how fast I'd be arrested? You can't sell food in a subway.
No.
That whole thing was just a smoke screen. It's just a big smoke screen. And it's very upsetting to put these poor people up. I don't want to say use them, but basically use them.
Yeah.
And
so I just want to end with addressing the black market, because we've mentioned that. And this law was actually enacted in an effort
that was written by them.
Curtail the black market. But the fallacy in the thinking is that if you increase the number of vendors on the street, you won't have a black market. But if you allow 4,000 on the street, there'll always be 4,001. I mean, that will always be the case. You can't curtail that with numbers. You have to do it with enforcement. And the council really thought that this Law 18 was going to be the panacea and get rid of the black market, meaning that vendors were selling, you know, people who have licenses were selling their life. This won't eliminate that at all. I saw nothing in it that would.
Well, Michelle, if you remember when we sat down with the council that day, we all met together. They basically said, "You're right. It is going to expand the black market, and we know it." Yeah. The city council, the mayor, the speaker's representative admitted it.
Yeah.
Well, so we know this, and Dan can speak to the numbers, but it's really going to, it's going to lower the cost of leasing permits. So it's going to make it even better for those who are leasing permits. It's crazy.
Not supposed to be able to lease permits. That's
the problem.
They're not allowed. It's supposed to be one permit, one card, etc. All right. Well, I think we got it. I think we understand what's going on. And I think the agenda for our next meeting has sort of written itself tonight. So we'll go forward with trying to plan something. I urge you to read Local Law 18 if you have thoughts about it, where it can be approved, even though, as I say, we can't go back and change the law, but we might be able to get some rules passed. So, you know, pay attention to that. Do what you can and what you will. And other than that, I want to thank everybody for being here. I appreciate your time. And Marco, any last words?
Oh, thank you so much, Michelle. You have been addressing completely thoroughly this session, and I think thank you so much for you present all the issues clearly in a historical way, because we need to let it know the public that especially you have been working more than me years before that I joined the committee, and that proves that our intentions is right there, but the decision makers are actually, they don't want to listen to us. And we have to keep fighting in order to improve the quality of life of our neighborhood. And I think thank you so much for everything. Thank you everybody for tonight, and good night. Thank you.
Good night, and thank you, Marco, for your help and all your evaluating on the streets and your taking note and you're visiting every vendor and plotting it and mapping it. There's a lot of work that goes into it. So I thank you as well. Anyway, I thank the public. We'll be back with our next meeting. If vending is an issue for you and your neighbors and people that you know, we're only caring about it as a quality of life issue. We are also happy to take complaints at the board office, which will be forwarded to me, which I will forward to the enforcing agency. If you see an infraction of a specific vendor and you have a specific site, I can pass that on to this department and to the Department of Health. So notify your neighbors and hope that they will participate in our next meeting as well. So thank you very much to Will and to Zachary. And with that, we'll say good night. Have a good night, everybody.
Motion to adjourn, Michelle. Can you second?
Oh, yes, we have to have a formal meeting, a formal move to adjourn. I seconded. All in favor of the community board, raise your
Aye.
hand. I think we're good. Monica seconded, and I think we're good. I think we can safely adjourn.
Thank
Good
you.
night,